Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming. The first thing I want to just bring up to all of you is that we have finally set up when the date and times and all of that is going to be for our Indispensable Leadership Conference, which is coming up in October 7th through 9th. So if anyone is interested about that, we have these pamphlets back there. Please feel free to ask me about it. We have a lesser amount, costs a lesser amount if you order the tickets in July. And this is a conference where we really take you through kind of the whole enchilada of using George Washington in order to help succeed and lead. And what we talk about, first of all, we're going to talk about it a little bit today as well. The main subject today is the omnipresent subject of change, and how George Washington and others have dealt with change and the importance of how you deal with change as a leader in your own life and in your leadership in your business. But at any event, we have a great faculty, and we would love to see you there. It's 3 days. It has seminars. It has tours. And what we do is we take you through from the beginning with how George Washington was able to choose his calling. And there's exercises. It's really an exciting event, and we would love to see all of you out there. So please feel free to ask me about it. The other thing we're starting out on is what is the world's first pockumentary. And so if you don't know what a pockumentary is, remember in the future when you're listening to a pockumentary, say, I heard the first pockumentary ever. Because a pockumentary is a combination of a documentary and a podcast. And so I have a few discs back there of the introduction. They are free. So if you want to do something as archaic as grab a CD to listen to it, you can do that. You can also check it out with chasingamericanhistory.com. I've discussed George Washington with a number of really terrific writers, Joseph Ellis, some others. And so what I do is I talk to you about George Washington, just like what I hope is a good podcast. But we also take these historians in and let them help to tell the story. And what I'm trying to do is get it so that you actually hear what the historians have to say, what is useful from the historians. It really bugs me when I watch the History Channel and you see somebody like Joseph Ellis and he says, so Washington went to war, and then they cut him off. So I think there's more interesting things you can hear from Joseph Ellis. So I want to have a pockumentary where you're introduced to these great writers and where you go through the whole story of George Washington. You know, I love multi-volume books. I just do. I think it takes multi-volumes to really understand somebody. And so we're not going to rush through George Washington's life. We're going to go through it all. We're going to talk about the different aspects of his life. We're going to really delve into what he did in the 7 Years' War. We're going to delve into a lot of the things that we talk about here. And I think you will enjoy it. So if you want to grab one of the CDs back there, there's just a few of them, but they are at no cost. But again, you can also check it out at chasingamericanhistory.com. So there you go. Those are the two exciting bits of news up ahead. Now today we're talking about change, the one omnipresent thing in the world. The most important thing that leaders deal with, and really probably the thing that separates the successful leader from the unsuccessful leader. And you know, in whatever job you have, you end up getting a question that you really hate to hear. I'm sure of it. I'm sure whatever job you have, there's one question you hate. When I was a lawyer, the question I hated was, the person would say, I've always wanted to ask a lawyer this. I'd say, yeah, I was a defense attorney. He said, what do you do when you're defending someone if you know they did it? So that was the question I used to always get. So what my answer was depended on how much alcohol I had had prior to hearing the question. Sometimes I'd say, well, that's never happened as a Philadelphia public defender. Yeah, but if it does, I guess I'll find out what it is. I don't get that cliche anymore. I get a couple other cliches. And these are cliches said with this ponderous gravity, as if this person searched hard and throughout their life to come up with it. One of the cliches is said with almost fear. And what's said is they're trying to rewrite history. And so, of course, what I tell them is that's what historians do. History is constantly being rewritten. If it wasn't, after the first book on George Washington, there wouldn't have been another one, right? So it's one of the most exciting things about history. I did a podcast with a guy, Kent Masterson Brown. If you're interested in Gettysburg and the Civil War, you should get his book. It's really interesting. And what he did is he found this whole new way of looking at the battle and this whole new way of looking at General Meade. And one of the ways he did this is he goes to the National Archives and he said, let me see all the documents that General Reynolds had in his uniform when he died. And here's this box, and he finds this handwritten description from Meade describing the battle that was going to come up. And most books had been written under the supposition that Meade was really dragged along this thing and didn't know. So here we are in 2021 when the book came out, coming with a new way to look at that. Joseph Ellis, in his newest book, The Cause, has given us ways at Bowtie Tours, the touring company that I'm a part of, new ways to teach the history, because every time he writes a book, he finds a new way to look at it. Currently, my favorite is Lincoln on the Verge, and anybody interested in history wants to get this. It's by a guy named Ted Widmer. And this is a book, what's the most interesting aspect of this book is how close it came before the Civil War to the Confederacy basically taking over the White House beforehand, and instead of having a civil war, just saying we're the United States. And what's really exciting, given the news that's gone on currently, is the Vice President of the United States, who was going to count the votes, he came in second in the voting against Lincoln. And so there was this plot. They said, well, all you got to say is the votes are wrong. Get rid of the votes, we'll make you the president, and then the North can worry about it, and if they want to fight. And I'm reading this thinking, why didn't it occur to me that this could have happened? You have a president who doesn't really care if it happens, and so anyway, that's the excitement, is rewriting history. You have to be ready to look at things in a new way, you know? I mean, it wasn't that long ago when we learned incontrovertibly for the first time that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings had a relationship and had children. I mean, we didn't know that until the DNA came out. Dumas Malone used to argue, and he wrote 7 books on Jefferson, and he kept arguing that it wasn't a fact, but we found out that it was a fact. So we're always going to be rewriting history. But to come to the cliche that we're really going to deal with today, it's usually attributed to Albert Einstein. And the cliche is, you can't do the same thing. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Right? You've all heard this, am I right? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So it's attributed to Einstein. I know he didn't say it because he's not an idiot, all right? Because Einstein, absolutely, if nobody else knows about change and nobody else knows about time, he does. You know, my son is here today with us. He likes to lift weights. Okay, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, he lifts weights. So let's say he says, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life, every Monday and Wednesday and Friday. Well, when he's doing it now, he's building muscle. If he's my age, he's not going to build muscle. He'll be doing the same thing, but there's no more muscle in there to be built. And so it's going to be a different result. And we've all learned this. I remember when I was probably in my late 40s, early 50s, I noticed I was losing weight. Wasn't even trying, just losing weight. I was going on the scale, and I told my wife, who's also here, I said, isn't this great? I lost 5 pounds. And she said, you didn't lose fat. You lost muscle. You're gaining fat. And I said, I've already told you all that everyone's either a Jefferson or an Adams, and an Adams is a truth teller, and I did marry an Adams. But of course she was right. I was losing weight because I was losing muscle mass. Change is the omnipresent of life. Change is the one thing that we never can escape. And the most successful leaders are the people who, number one, they realize change when it's happening. But the real successful ones see change before it does happen. And I'm going to tell you a more modern story that goes along with this. But you have people who run for office who will go one way or the other. You know, there's always this desire to refuse to accept change. And sometimes in the short term that can work. People can win elections. So let's go back. You know, let's go back to when children were pleasant. You know, when there was no interleague play in baseball. Let's just go back. And if you've all seen the Andy Griffith Show. It's this brilliant show in the beginning, and then it went on and on and on, didn't it? And it became Mayberry RFD, and at one point you're like, why is this show still on? Well, it was just this thing that people would go to deny change. It was this beautiful, here's Mayberry. Yeah, because think about it, at the time this is being made, you have the civil rights fights going on, you have Vietnam. Does Opie look concerned about Vietnam? No, there's no Vietnam in Mayberry RFD. This is this beautiful land of no change. And sometimes people can try to take you back into that, and like I say, you can get a short term of that. Then there's those politicians who really celebrate that they're moving forward, moving in the future. Of course, John F. Kennedy. This is a new generation. You know, that's what he told everybody in his inaugural. We've been tempered by war. We're different from the last generation. People can sometimes become, their reputations ruined by doing things the way everyone else did them. You know, you think that's safe, right? So somebody like Hoover, who just, I don't know about you, when I learned about Hoover, I never learned one good thing about the guy. But he really didn't do anything differently. He just didn't adapt to change. And so in the long run, if you do not adapt to change, you're going to run into a lot of trouble. Now, George Washington was brilliant at being able to adapt to change. He adapted to change in his personal life. He adapted to change in his political life. And he was able to see change before it came. And it's one of the reasons that he was as successful as he was. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about in terms of George Washington and change is his calling. We talked probably in our first week, those of you who were here, about George Washington and his calling and how important it is to find your true calling. But what I didn't mention maybe then is your calling might change a lot. You know, just because you have a calling doesn't mean that's always your calling. My calling when I was about 10, I wanted to be an actor. When I was 18, I wanted to be a musician. And I went on to, there was a dark period where I wanted to be a lawyer there. And then I got out of that, and it changes. Now, in your private life, one of the worst things you can do is ignore it when this changes, and I think a lot of people make that mistake. You know, you get the education, you get the degree, you're doing the thing, and you start, you know, you like it at first, but after 10 years, you don't like it so much. And there's a lot of people who just try to deny that and try to get away from it. But it's important to notice things. It's important to be able to change. You know, one of my favorite people in terms of change is Neil Young. I mean, if Neil Young feels bad about it for 5 minutes, he quits. Like, he just walks off the stage. And that's why they'll say Crosby, Still, Nash, and Young, ? Because they don't know if he's going to stick with it on the tour. And when I saw a documentary about him, you know, when he was a very young man, he's a teenager, he has a hit record with his first band, he's doing great. It's the dream, right? He's a kid. Well, 1 week into the tour, he quit. He quit the band. Now that's self-confidence, because Neil Young knew I'm Neil Young. I can redo whatever I did here. I can have another hit record. I can come back. You know, that's his ability to, when it doesn't feel like what he's doing is authentic, he moves on. I have this great record of Sonny Rollins. It's called Sonny Rollins at the Village Vanguard. It's a 2-record set. There's a different drummer and bassist on the second record than on the first record. Well, what happened? He was at the Village Vanguard. There were a lot of great musicians, and he didn't like the bassist and the drummer the way they played the first set, so he fired them. And he hired 2 people from the audience, and they played on the second set. So these are people very attuned to going forward and making change. You know, you have to make the big change. Lou Reed, he got a new liver, right? And then he said, great, I can go back to drinking again. So he destroyed that liver too. So it's not enough just to change the liver. You have to sometimes change what you're doing. George Washington was very clear on his calling. George Washington's calling was, I'm going to be a gentleman and a leader in my area of Virginia. And he knew how he was going to do that. Well, how was that? He was going to go to college in Europe. You had to go to college in Europe to become a gentleman, and then he was going to be in the military with the British. The British were legit. He didn't want to be just a Virginia provincial. He wanted to be with the British, and that was his whole desire, and that was what his ambition was. And we know it from his notes, we know it from what he was thinking, and then his dad dies when he's 11. And when his dad died, that changed everything. He wasn't able to go to college. He didn't go to any college. Not only did he not go to a college in Europe, and he was stuck there with his mother. And his mother really didn't want him going off and leaving the home and doing anything. And so he had to find a way out of that. And ultimately, he had to differentiate his primary goal from his means of getting that goal, right? Like you might think, I'm going to go to the Wyoming College for writing, but that's not really your calling or your goal. Your goal is to be a writer. And then if you don't make it into that college, you find a different way. What George Washington did was, well, he started surveying, first of all. Take what you can gather from coincidence, I always tell you. He goes up to his attic, he finds surveying equipment, and he gets to know the family, the Fairfax family, and he starts to do everything he can to get away in a different way. And he makes a lot of mistakes. He's thin-skinned because he's pushing himself as a gentleman, but he really isn't a gentleman. He's going to keep trying to get and join the British because he sees that as his standard of legitimacy. And so part of his whole life is opening his mind to the concept that there's a whole other way of looking at legitimacy. And I'm going to tell you about another group that does this, but people say if you can't beat them, join them. It's also true in history, if you can't join them, beat them sometimes. You know, George Washington tried to join the British a lot. He tried it over and over when he was fighting in the 7 Years' War. And so he followed this maxim, if you can't join them, beat them at the end of the day. Now, one of the things that George Washington is going to change drastically about is his regionalism. George Washington grows up as a Virginian, and in his early days, he's always pushing Virginia. He gets very angry with Benjamin Franklin because Franklin and Washington are both kind of struggling against each other to get Governor Dinwiddie, later to get General Braddock to kind of be for them. And George Washington, when he's working with Braddock, Braddock wants to get all these carriages, and George Washington can't get it for him. And Franklin hears about this, and we talked about Benjamin Franklin one day. I talked about this, but basically Franklin threatened everyone in the town and said, listen, if you don't just give him your carriages, he's going to take them, which wasn't true. But if you do give them, he'll end up paying you when he has money, which is true. And so here's Washington kind of complaining with Braddock and trying to do it. Well, Franklin just shows up with carriages. So, of course, Braddock loved Benjamin Franklin. Well, now we have this big fight about how are we going to get a road, where are we going to put the road through when the road's going to go out to the Pittsburgh area, right, where the French are. And George Washington wants that road to be through Pennsylvania. And he pushed this so hard, he really hurt himself politically, because Governor Dinwiddie the general who was then in charge, they all said, you know, this guy doesn't care about this effort. He doesn't care about his men. He's just worried about getting a road built to Pittsburgh so that he and his buddies can end up going there to purchase land. Now, he is going to change dramatically when it comes to this. When he first becomes named the general of the colonial forces, he goes out, and of course he's going to go out to Boston, and these Bostonians they're very different from Virginians. He barely can understand them. He says I can't tell the officers from the privates. Says, how can I choose officers? I don't know their family members. And he writes a letter. And this is the last time he makes a mistake like this, but he calls the Bostonians an exceedingly dirty people. And that letter, as many letters did in that day, it went to the wrong place and it got published. And then he had an epiphany that, you know, I can't keep looking at it this way, like it's them and it's me. We're not going to win this if we're not all in this, all of us together. And this becomes his greatest obsession for the rest of his life. Creating a national purpose, even before we have a nation. During the war, he's going to talk about it constantly. When he speaks to his army, this is very early on, he says, "It is hoped that all distinctions of colonies will be laid aside so that one and the same spirit may animate the whole, and the only contest be who shall render on this great and trying occasion the most essential service to the great and common cause in which we are all engaged." He's going to become obsessed with that. And when the British attack Virginia, Patrick Henry and others say, "Bring your army to Virginia. This is where your home is. You've got to come here." And he wouldn't do that. He said, I'm not here as a Virginian, I'm here as an American now. Now, Robert E. Lee, he's the opposite of that. He never gets beyond Virginia. And it's funny, when Jefferson Davis orders him to go help in a battle out in Mississippi, he just says, no, that would help Mississippi, but it wouldn't help Virginia. I mean, he's very honest about that. He never gets beyond Virginia. George Washington feels like the most important thing, both during the war, after the war, is creating this national movement. He's going to take a journey when he becomes president to every single one of the states. And people hear about that and think, oh, that's nice. That's not so easy back then. That was many months. That was in a carriage that wasn't that comfortable. He said, I'm not going to stay in people's homes. I'm going to stay in taverns that they would stay in. He's showing that he's the president of everybody. And he's not a Virginian anymore. And that's why he did that particular thing. Now, I'm going to talk about Washington's farewell address from time to time. It's really quite an incredible document because this is a monument to George Washington and understanding change. George Washington is talking to his people, he's talking to the future, he's talking to us. When he's going to do his final farewell address after his 8 years as president, he's reaching out to the future. And everybody used to become obsessed with this. This used to be reprinted more than the Declaration of Independence. And what he's going to say in that farewell address is this: the unity of government which constitutes you one people is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. Citizens by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. This is George Washington looking at what's going to become the Civil War and trying to avoid it. And he's saying that right there right at that time. This is something you need to be connected with beyond your locality. And you can't let anything destroy that affection and that bond. And Washington's doing that because he knows what's coming down the road. He sees what's going to happen. Now, another thing George Washington had to change was his abilities as a speaker. And all of us have things we feel we can't do very well. You know, the bane of my existence is technology now. There are my torture machines there. I love doing podcasts. I often have difficulty making it work. And people can often stop themselves from moving forward by the story they tell themselves, which is just that they can't do something. Now, George Washington is never going to be a Patrick Henry. George Washington is never going to be a great speaker. He knows that. But he knows something else, too. If I'm going to lead this country, I have to be an adequate speaker. I can't just say, well, I don't do that. I can't. I'm going to be needed. And so I need to use what I'm good at. So, you know, I'm not going to imitate somebody, but I have to get better at this because it's going to be important. I can't just say, I don't know how to do this. It's funny because you read the notes about when he first becomes the general, and they took him out, not to City Tavern, but to a tavern along the Schuylkill River, and everyone writes about how Washington couldn't respond, that he didn't know what to say and that he fumbled, and they write with much confusion, and then people sort of gave him a break and said, well, he's too humble, but he didn't know what to say and he didn't know how to do it. And I think he knew that he had to figure that out. And he's going to make two speeches that are among the most important speeches in American history in terms of effect. Right? There's speeches that we all love because they're great. But these are two speeches that the country needed. Now, one of them comes after Washington's crossing of the Delaware. And you know that if you take this conference in October, we're going to spend a day on Washington crossing the Delaware, because you take this story, and actually we're having a writer come in next month to talk about his book on crossing the Delaware, but you take this story and it tells you everything you need to know about success and leadership. But anyway, one of the reasons he's going to do this attack is he wants a victory because a lot of his men are going home on December the 31st. Their time is up. Why? Congress is terrified of having a standing army. We can't stop a standing army if they attack us. And George Washington tries to convince the Congress we cannot win this war without a standing army. We can't just do it with militias. That's a very nice romantic ideal, but it's not going to work. We have to have an army. And so they cross the Delaware, of course, and they win a victory in Trenton. And then they go back, and then he brings them back, and he has to talk them into joining up. And he says something, somebody else says something, nobody joins up. And then this is from somebody who was there at the time, who was a sergeant. And this sergeant wrote that he remembered Washington in the most affectionate manner and treated us to stay. The general wheeled his horse about, rode in front of the regiment, and addressing us again said, "My brave fellows, you have done all I asked you to do, and more than could be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake. Your wives, your house, and all that you hold dear. You have worked yourselves out with fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you. If you will consent to stay, you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country, which you probably never can do under any other circumstances. The present is emphatically the crisis which is to decide our destiny." So it's not quite Henry V, but it's close enough. A lot of people joined up again because of what he said, because of the way he addressed them. This is the thing about change. George Washington understood that I can't treat my army the way most generals treat their armies. Most generals don't particularly care what their members of their army think. You know, if you're in Prussia, you order your army. George Washington knows that's not going to work here. Now, nobody tells him this. He knows this. He knows that, okay, this is going to take a while, and I have to keep these people engaged. How am I going to do that? And he does it by fellowship, by being one of them, by talking to them about what they're thinking, what they're feeling. You know, when the Declaration of Independence comes out, he orders everybody has to have this read to them. Now, that's an unusual thing for a general in that time to care whether his soldiers are hearing about the cause of the war. But Washington understands it's absolutely necessary. And when Thomas Paine writes and publishes his work, he had the night before they crossed the Delaware, he has people reading it to everybody who's about to do that, because he understands that he's got to convince them to do all of this. They're not just going to do it because they're ordered to do it. He doesn't go home. He doesn't go home for the 8 years of the war. That's very unusual back then. Generals often would go home for months. The British generals go back to England and come back. George Washington knew, I can't do that. I have to be in this thing with them. That's how I keep them doing it. And so I love this quote from this guy who talks about how he's affectionate with them and how he does the thing with the horse. You know, he basically asked them, looked in their eyes, and he was able to get enough people that we have those amazing 10 days, because we win another battle in Trenton and then the battle out in Princeton, because he's able to get enough people to come back. So that's one of the most important speeches that we'll have in the country. The other is at Newburgh. A number of people were ready to quit. A number of people were ready to go back to Philadelphia and to demand their money in the army because they hadn't been paid. And old Horatio Gates is stoking the fires, and they decide to meet, and they decide that they're going to discuss whether to do this, whether to march on Philadelphia. Well, George Washington sees this as an end of everything they fought for. He wants a Republican government. He thinks if we march on there, this is going to become a military dictatorship like happens so often in these kind of situations. So he shows up at the meeting, and he takes over the meeting. And he starts telling them, and this is where he's going to cash in on what he did throughout those 8 wars. He says, you know, this isn't somebody walking in and talking to you for the first time. I've been with you these 8 years. I've suffered with you. George Washington, of course, did not get paid. He when he was made the general, he said he would not get paid. Now, he did say he wanted expenses paid, and a lot of historians say he got more money that way than if he'd gotten paid, but we won't quibble about that. He didn't get paid. And so he starts telling them about the meaning of what they're thinking of doing. He says the whole war will have been rendered meaningless if we march there and if we demand that money. And then he tells them he's going to read them a letter that he's written to Congress arguing their case. And he puts his glasses on, and people are pretty surprised. They've never seen him with glasses, and he says, I hope you'll excuse me, but not only has my hair gone gray in service of my country, my eyes have gone blind. And what people who were there say is everyone's affected. You know, maybe this is kind of a stagey moment on George Washington's part. But again, he knows his power is not from being Superman, but by showing weakness, showing he's one of them. When he does that, he's going to convince them not to do that. So this is the second point where perhaps he saves the country. You think you could get me some water, Garth? Washington is a military strategist. He's going to change. He's going to see how the British fight in the 7 Years' War. And he's going to learn the weaknesses behind the British. And he's not scared of the British in this war because he's seen the British run. He's seen the British show weakness. So there you have it. If you can't join them, beat them. Put it on my tab, please. You know, there's a great story that's somewhat like this from modern times, and that's the Netflix battle against Blockbuster. The guy who creates Netflix, Mark Randolph, he has this great quote. He says, there's no such thing as a good idea, because he says every idea is bad for one reason or another until you kind of figure out how to get past it. But anyway, he had all these ideas of what to sell. Custom-made dog food, custom-made shampoo, all these things. And one of them was, I'm going to mail people VHSs. It didn't make sense because it was going to cost too much money. So then, one day he and his buddy are driving, and they hear on the radio there's this new thing called the DVD. It's going to be like a CD. So they literally, you know, he's not going to study this. They turn around, they say, let's buy a DVD and see how cheap it would be to mail it. So they do it that second. They turn back, and they spend 3 hours looking for a DVD. Well, it's a prototype, so there isn't one. So they get back in the car like, oh, well. And then his buddy goes, well, didn't they say the DVD is the same thing as a CD? It's like, oh, you're right. So they went back and they bought a CD. And they stuck it in an envelope and they mailed it. And they're like, look at this, one stamp, it works. And so he has this idea of mailing these things out. And he starts this company, Netflix. And when it starts, they're doing pretty well, but nobody's renting. Everybody's buying. But he's making a living. He's doing pretty well. They're making over $100,000 a month. But he's not willing to give up on his idea, partly because he can see change. And what he sees is, okay, Amazon's going to take over all of that. We're not going to beat Amazon. They're going to be the superstore. And he sees this. We're going to make this something where we can get them to rent from us. So, .com goes belly up for a period of time. He starts losing tons of money. He decides, I need to meet with the Blockbuster people. Blockbuster's on top. Everybody everyone's going to Blockbuster. And so he finally says, listen, we're going to have to, let's offer to do this for Blockbuster. We'll mail out their DVDs. We'll take over that part of the company for them, because this is the future. And so when he get invited to talk to Blockbuster, they'd actually been off on a seminar, so they show up in like Hawaiian shirts and flip-flops, which didn't help a lot. And the people in Blockbuster have beautiful suits, and they come in, and so Randall, they ask, well, what would you charge? And he says, $50 million for us to do this, and they laughed at him. And so now, it's if you can't join them, beat them, right? They're like, well, now not only did we not get joined by Blockbuster, but now they're our competition. So they said, what's the good thing about this fight? And he realized no one likes Blockbuster, because they punish you all the time. They're always, remember the late fees? Like they said, this is a bad business model. Most of your interactions with this company are unpleasant, and you're angry with them. And so we're going to create a thing where there's no such thing as a late fee. This was the epiphany. And like 3 years after he wouldn't give them the $50 million, it was worth $250 billion. And Blockbuster, of course, went away. Now that's the difference of knowing change when it's coming, and it's the difference of people not falling in love with their past success. Because when you do that, you're not seeing what's coming around. And pretty interesting story. And I can remember it. I was ordering upstairs, downstairs. Of course, that's the kind of thing I watch. And they kept saying it's on hold, it won't come. I mean, for 5 months I waited from Blockbuster, and then I did Netflix, it was there the next day. Boom, that was the end. Like, they decided, how can we serve the client? What does the client want? And all of you who had Netflix, you know that when a DVD was broken, you just wrote it on the computer and you got another one. They didn't become police officers asking you how did it happen, right? So that's what happens when you see change coming on. Washington's going to make a speech when he resigns from the Army. And this would have been one of his most famous moments if he didn't supplant it by resigning from the presidency. But, you know, after the war happens, people think, well, he's going to become what? He's going to become an emperor or something like that. And there's this great story where King George is getting his painting done, and he tells the painter, who's from Philadelphia, Benjamin West. And he tells Benjamin West, I don't know what the fuss was all about. All you did was exchange one King George for another King George. And Benjamin West tries to tell him that George Washington's not going to become a king. And King George is very dubious. Of course he's not going to go home and be a farmer. But of course that's King George, that's George Washington's hero, is Cincinnatus, who saves Rome, and he goes back. And George Washington is determined to do that. And so he's going to resign in 1783. And he writes to a friend, he says, before I retire from public life, I shall with the greatest freedom give my sentiments to the states on several political subjects. So he wrote a 4,000-page address. He wrote it in Newburgh, as a matter of fact. He's overlooking the Hudson. And the first thing he says is, we're in a crisis. Now, no one's thinking that they're in a crisis. They just won the war. He says, this is the moment to establish or ruin our national character forever. It is yet to be decided whether the revolution must ultimately be considered as a blessing or a curse not to the present age alone, for with our fate will the destiny of unborn millions be involved. He said there's four things which I humbly conceive are essential to the well-being, I may even venture to say to the existence of the United States as an independent power. One is that we have to have a union of the states under one federal head. Here he is, we've just had the war, and he's looking at change, right? He's looking at what it was like to be a general when there was no federal head. He's looking at what's going to happen in the future. What's going to happen if there's a war? How are we going to have treaties? How are we going to have trade? He's already looking at the next problem. In his mind, we're already in a crisis. We just won the war. And there's a brilliant book about the Constitutional Convention called The Framers' Coup, because if you took a poll, probably 80% of the public did not want a constitution. The people who wanted one were the people looking ahead, the people seeing, well, what's going to happen when? And so George Washington's going to start this off immediately. That's the first thing he says. We have to have one federal head. He says we have to have a sacred regard to public justice, fair judicial system. He's also talking here about payment of his soldiers. You know, he promised his soldiers he would get them that pay, and he's still fighting to get them that pay, and that's going to be a long-standing problem. The adoption of a proper peace establishment. He wants there to be an army, a standing army, and that's a very difficult issue, because standing armies are dangerous in those days. Even England doesn't have a standing army because they will turn around and attack. But Washington's feeling is, we'll have a republic. We're going to have it done in such a way that that's not a danger. Elevation of national unity over local, inducing us to forget their local prejudices and policies. Again, this obsession of his. We've got to get beyond what colony you're from. We've got to get beyond what state from. We will never make it together unless we all go forward in this way. And so that's going to be the obsession Washington has through most of his life. Then we do have this farewell address. Washington looking towards the future to tell everybody what his feelings are. He's going to decry the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally, and he argued that if partisanship became too drastic, it could gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. He also warned that hyper-partisanship could, quote, open the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. He was worried that this could facilitate the rise of a cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled man who would manipulate partisan anger to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust domination. So this is George Washington back then, talking about issues that we continue to deal with. He's going to talk about national unity. He's going to talk about that. He's going to talk about fiscal discipline. He says you have to have the fiscal house in order. He's going to talk about virtue and religion. He's going to talk about the importance of education, and he's going to talk about foreign policy and say that we need a foreign policy that avoids us becoming entangled in the battles and fights of the other countries. We need a foreign policy that's useful to us and not making us useful to others. Now there's going to be one last time George Washington is going to talk to the American people, and that's in his will. And in his will, he's going to make, again, maybe his most important statement when he frees his slaves in his will. And Washington and slavery is yet another moment where George Washington is looking towards the future, better than those people around him. Washington grows up accepting slavery as a reality of life, doesn't evidently think about it a great deal. Now, Washington's going to change about that. And there's several books about this. Mary Thompson's is the best book. Henry Weincheck has a book as well. Studying Washington and slavery. What makes Washington change? Because again, we see this tremendous change. And some people like to say, oh, he saw them fight in the war and that changed his attitude about African Americans, which may be true. But the first big change, when he's first the general, he says, well, we can't have African Americans fighting alongside whites. That's just almost a automatic response from a Virginian of that time. But pretty quickly, he changes his mind on it. Pretty quickly, he decides we got to get above that local prejudice because these are people who can help us win this war. And so he's going to make that change before most Southerners make that change. He's going to decide we will have African Americans. And this is the last integrated army until Korea. He understands what's important there. And what's going to change him in the future is he's looking around the world and he's looking at this country, and he basically sees that the future is a non-slave future. He sees what's happening in France. He sees what's happening in England. He sees, he's become a nationalist. And he doesn't want to go bury himself in Virginia and deny the reality. He knows people like Lafayette. And so he's not a St. Francis kind of guy. He's not going to make a big announcement probably, but he struggles with it. And we look at Thomas Jefferson and we look at George Washington in terms of slavery, and it's two very different stories. Jefferson writes these ringing arguments against slavery, but I always say that Jefferson's like Augustine, who says, God make me good, but not today. Right? Jefferson says, please end slavery, but not before I build a mansion on top of a mountain. And then Jefferson's going to say, I'm for the total abolition of slavery as soon as it's practicable. That's good. It'll never be practicable. It's never going to be easy. So he just kind of puts it into his philosophical little mold, and yeah, it should end, and lives his life. But George Washington struggles with it. George Washington writes to people about it, and he's trying to solve it. And so when he writes this will, he's trying to show a way out. He's trying to show a way out. And it's not just, people probably think it's just something that says, by the way, my slaves are freed. Where are they going to go? It's a long document. And some of the slaves are given choices. Some of them, the older ones, you can stay if you want to, you convert, education. It's a really well thought out thing. And I know he's hoping everybody else is going to follow that. Now, no other of the founders are going to. Partly because another way George Washington commits change, all the other farmers are just going along the way they always did. And they're making tobacco even though it's destroying their land. And George Washington, he's not an intellectual. So he's not off reading the kind of books that Adams and Jefferson Madison are reading. He's reading about agriculture. He's reading what tobacco does to your land. He's reading about rotating crops. And so he's going to be the only founder from Virginia who isn't bankrupt at the end of the day, because he's going to make those changes. You know, tobacco was the craziest thing. If you sold tobacco, you had to sell it to England, and they would pay you what they wanted. And there's a lot of fights, you know, they would weigh it when they got there, and they'd say, oh, there was a lot of extraneous material in here. But here's the thing, they would not pay you money. They would pay you credit. So that's like if you got paid by credit from Amazon, right? You'd have a lot of great stuff, but you'd have no money. And so George Washington decided pretty quickly, well, that's a bad idea. It's ruining the land. I have to send it to England, and they pay me whatever they want. And so he starts finding other crops. He starts finding other things. He starts producing alcohol. He starts making nails, catching fish, things he can sell to his neighbors, things he can actually make money from, rather than just continuing this process of sending everything to England. So at the end of the day, George Washington, a great part of his strength is his constant ability to go along with change and to see change when it's around the corner, and to really be prepared for it when it comes. I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody might have about change and George Washington and change.